fellow students, Hofstra faculty, and Hofstra guests. My name is Will Davis, president of the Xi Psi chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated and a member of the class of 2020. It gives me great honor to welcome you to this signature event, the Black Tax. I'm extremely excited about tonight's presentation, which was made possible due to the collaborative effort with the Cultural Center. Shawn D. Rochester is the CEO of Good Steward LLC and the founder of PhD Enterprises and the Idea Institute. These organizations provide financial education and advisory services to consumers, increase the presence of Black employees and enterprise in U.S. public and private sectors, payroll, and supply chains, and facilitate commerce between the Black business community across the African diaspora and on the African continent. Shawn Rochester is also an author and sought-after speaker who has spoken on Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, at leading universities and the United Nations about the staggering financial costs of discrimination against Black people in America and a new economic framework to help create the millions of jobs and businesses that are missing in the Black community. Shawn Rochester has a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Rochester and a master's degree in Business Administration from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He is the author of The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America, and soon to be released, CPR for the Soul, which I was just talking about, how to give yourself a 20% raise, eliminate your debt, and leave an inheritance for your children's children. Well, thank you again for coming out. And without further ado, please help me welcome Shawn Rochester to the stage.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you guys for being here this evening. I think it says a lot about you as individuals and as a group. I'm very excited to spend this evening with you. So my name is Shawn Rochester, and I've written this book called The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And in the book, I talk about the financial cost of discrimination against Black people. Now, normally when we talk about discrimination, we talk about it from the perspective of the injustice or the immorality associated with it. I wanted to look at things a little differently. I wanted to look at what is the financial cost associated with it. And more importantly, what does research say that those costs are? So the book's broken into three parts. The first part talks about what I call the present Black tax, the financial impact of discrimination in markets that are critical to wealth accumulation in general and African Americans in particular. So we're talking about real estate, we're talking about automotive, the financing and insurance that go along with that. We're talking about online commerce and the job search, high-end careers, capital raising for businesses, etc. The second part of the book, I talk about the historical cost of discrimination, where I do a look back from the time of slavery up until the present. And in the third portion of the book, I kind of summarize where we are economically and then propose a framework that can help to address these issues. This framework is called PhD, and PhD stands for purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs and create businesses and expand businesses in the Black community. Why is this of particular importance? Because one, we're missing about 6 million jobs across the broader Black community in America. We're missing about 1.4 million businesses with employees. So while there are about 2.6 million Black businesses in the country, only about 4% of those businesses, about 109,000, actually have employees. And that 4% drives almost 70% of all revenues that's driven by Black enterprise and employ almost 1 million people. So those businesses are super critical. And we only have about 109,000 of them, and we're missing about 1.4 million. And then collectively, our collective balance sheets, we're missing about or over $8 trillion of net worth. These are massive problems, right? And as the case with massive problems, it's really important that we get like a lot of people at the table to work on them. But what we will often notice is that it's very difficult to work with folks who A, don't see the problem, or B, think you're the problem. If you would only fix you, then we would be great, right? And I'm sure we've heard these platitudes. You know, Black folks are really just not trying hard enough. And quite frankly, that has more to do with getting ahead than anything that's associated with discrimination. You know, 6 in 10 Americans believe that over that. You may have heard that, you know, Black folks have the same opportunities or even better, quite frankly, than anybody else to get ahead. Another 6 in 10 Americans believe that. Or you may have heard, listen, quite frankly, Black people use racism as an excuse for failure. The failure is mine. I refuse to take responsibilities for my actions, and I wind up blaming everybody else. I'm not the only person who's been discriminated against. We're not the only people who've had a difficult time in the country, but other people have managed to progress in substantial ways, and we haven't. 7 in 10 Americans believe that. Now, the challenge with this is if this is the thinking, then that thinking is going to be reflected in the strategies and the programs that are put in place to address major economic issues within our communities. And as always, really effective problem solving requires 2 really critical things. The first is empathy, the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes to understand their path and how they got there. And the other portion is understanding, which is using knowledge and information and facts in effective ways to uplift your fellow man. And one of the things that's easy to observe is that these are 2 things that seem to be in short supply in this day and age. I wanted to share a quote with you from Albert Einstein. And he said this in an address that he did to the National Urban League in 1946. And he said, listen, we must make every effort to ensure that the past injustice, violence, and economic discrimination, that is the Black tax, will be made known to the people. The taboo, let's not talk about it, must be broken. So in that spirit, let's talk about it. And the portion of it that I want to address tonight is this. How is it that after 400 years, over 40 million African Americans only own about 2% of US wealth? Either we are colossally and consistently inept, or there is something else happening in the environment that we need to take a closer look at. So we're going to take a closer look at that environment. So the first thing we're going to need to do is kind of go back in time, go back to the time of slavery. We won't go into detail about what transpired. There's been tombs written on that. But what we're going to do is look at things from an economic perspective, right? One of the first things I want you to understand is that slavery, by definition, is a 100% tax on your labor. It means that nothing that you produce is yours. You are not even yours. Now, there's many things that we could never price or value from that time. You could never price or value what it is to be a woman and to never have control of your body over the entirety of your life. You can never price what it is to be a man and to be unable to protect your spouse or your daughter or your mother, so on and so forth. or to ever be able to reap the fruits of your labor. But one of the things that you can value is the cost of the labor extracted from those people over 250 years, about a quarter of a millennia, millions of people. And economists have tried to do that. Some put the number at up to 24 trillion. Others put it as high as 97 trillion. Let's say that the truth is somewhere in the middle. We could be talking about as high as $50 trillion, right? It's a massive number. It's an extraordinary number. And even if you've never seen that number before, you're taking time to digest it, that's not the only thing that we can price from that period. Because if we kind of fast forward to 1860, you've got 4 million people in bondage. They are the most liquid asset in the country. They represent 50% of all value in the South. And if you're old, there's a price. And if you're young, there's a price. And if you're able-bodied, there's a price. And if you're not, there's a price. And if you're male or female, there's a price. And people were traded on open markets. So if you look at what is the value of those folks, it turns out that the value is so large that economists say you have to measure it in terms of GDP, national income, or net wealth. That's how large it is. So if you look at it from a net wealth standpoint, we're talking about 15.5 trillion. Now you say to yourself, Shawn, how you come up with 15.5 trillion, right? So national wealth is roughly $85 trillion for the United States. Economists put the value of Black people held in bondage between 16 and 20% of national wealth. If you put it on an equivalent basis of what it would be today. So 16 to 20% is about 14 to 17 trillion dollars of today's equivalent. Take an average of those, you're at 15.5. If you measured it from a GDP standpoint, national income, they say it's between 1 and 2 years of national income, right? So if you looked at that, it's about 28.5 trillion. How do you come up with that number? Well, national income is about 19 trillion a year. So you're talking about between 19 and 38 trillion. If you take an average between the two, you're at 28.5. So if you value it from a net income standpoint, you're close to 16. If you look at it from a net income standpoint, you're close to 29. If you look at it from a wealth standpoint, it's almost 16. If you took an average of those two things, which we do when we're making valuations, you're talking about $22 trillion in today's equivalent. The point here is that no matter how you look at this, you're talking about massive, hard to conceive numbers in size and scope. So let's talk a little bit about the economic implication of that, right? So if you look at the 45 million African Americans today, their net worth in total is about $1.5 trillion. About 1.5. So we just established that if you value those 4 million slaves in 1860 in today's equivalent, we're talking about 22 trillion. So what does that imply? It implies that 4 million slaves 152 years ago was worth 15 times more to the country than 45 million African Americans today. Those are the numbers and the fact pattern. So in terms of slavery, we could say up to $50 trillion. Now you can say, listen, I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was that bad. However, while it was a tragic period, it did come to an end, right? And it came to an end a long time ago. And there's been plenty of time since then to accumulate resources, right? So, you can't pin it all on that period. You could say, yeah, I hear what you're saying. Let's talk about that a little bit, right? Because what we have to remember is that people were emancipated. They left bondage with no capital, no resources. In 1870, African Americans owned about 0.17% of US wealth. It's effectively nothing, right? Now, there was some talk about providing land, right? And a mule. That's the 40 acres and a mule. We all heard about that, right? That, of course, never happened. there is something that did happen that's called the Homestead Act. And we're going to kind of look at those two things real quick and kind of talk about the implication of it. So if you think about 40 acres and a mule, a great question to ask is, well, what would that be worth today? Right? So you got 4 million people in bondage. You're talking about 40 acres and a mule. Quick math puts that at 160 million acres, right? It's really hard to conceive what that is. I once looked at some land with a group of friends, about 400 acres. 400 acres, you need to go up in a helicopter. 160 million, hard to conceive, right? If you think about what would that be worth today, well, like the average price of an acre is, it's between $3,000, $20, and it can go as high as 6,350, which means on a high end, that's about $1 trillion. That's what that would be worth in today's equivalent. And it'll be generating about $90 billion a year. You can check all these numbers, right? So substantial. On the one hand, it's substantial, right? On the other hand, it's only about 2% of what was actually extracted from those people and their forefathers. And not even 2% as startup resources was allowed to happen. But there is something that actually did happen, right? In 1862, Congress passed this law, the Homestead Act. And because of this law, they would proceed to distribute about 246 million acres to 1.5 million white families, right? So if you looked at that from the same kind of valuation methodology, you're talking about $1.6 trillion in total, or the equivalent of about $1 million a family on the high end. Now listen, I'm all about hard work and bootstraps, but $1 million, them a hella bootstraps, right? So how did it work? The way it worked was this. People had the opportunity to claim, maybe up to 160 acres. And if you were able to claim it and you stayed on it for 5 years, that's the stead part of the homestead, right? Then you could take possession of it after the 5 years. Now, here's something else to note. So that means, you could be an immigrant coming from another country. You have a chance to claim this land. And if you did, you took possession of it after 5 years. But the other thing that happened after 5 years is you could naturalize as a citizen. That's about how long it took. So you could come here literally with nothing but the shirt on your back. And in 5 years, be in an extraordinary financial position. Now, researchers say that there are about up to 93 million white Americans are direct beneficiaries of this. Direct beneficiaries, not tertiary, not secondary, not kind of, sort of, some way related, direct of a massive, government giveaway, right? So in terms of the potential of land that would have been distributed, you're talking about on the high end, about $1 trillion. That was denied, right? But at the same time, $1.6 trillion worth of value was distributed. Important to know. So if we fast forward a couple of years from 1860, we get to the point where you have the Civil War is happening and then has happened. And the context is this, the Southern economy is devastated, right? The global cotton market is devastated. The land confiscated in the Civil War from the South by the North is given back to them. And they have a massive demand for cheap, abundant labor. I'm going to pause there because I just fast forward through like a lot of really important stuff, right? But I'm going to just highlight a couple really key things for you to understand. So the global cotton market is a big deal. It's the first global industry. It's the equivalent of oil today, right? Slaves in the South, in bondage, people produced that cotton. That cotton represented 61% of exports from the US. And it was 80% of the global cotton market. You just can't beat free labor. There are about 20 million people around the world employed in that industry in some way or form. About 1 million of those lose their jobs with the Civil War and the emancipation of these people. It's a big deal. It affects India and Egypt and Russia and Japan and Europe, and all kinds of different places. And the world's crying out like, what is America going to do to put her newly freed people back to work? It's a huge issue. And the solution for that is this thing called Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow is an amazingly nondescript name for something. It's kind of like the Shawn Rochester period. Dun, dun, dun. Right? So what is the Jim Crow period? The Jim Crow is basically a system of laws and customs that are reinforced with an extraordinary level of violence to impose a 100% tax on a sharecropper's labor. I know what you're thinking. Shawn, you sound a little hyperbolic. 100% tax on these people's labor. I know they were poor, but they had something. I'm like, listen, I hear you. I hear you. I'll let you decide if it's 100% tax, right? We'll keep going. So what's sharecropping and how does it work? Basically, those large, mega plantations were broken into smaller lots. Black families would then settle on those lots. They would agree to plant and cultivate cash crops. At the end of the season, they would bring those crops to market, and then they would share in a portion of the crops, right? So sharecropping. Here's a challenge. It was an actual contract, the terms and conditions of which were set by the small white farmer. Something that's very important to remember is that these people have effectively no wealth, and that the crop does not come tomorrow. The crop comes at the end of the season or at the end of the year. And between now and then, that white farmer has got to provide you with the seeds and the tools and the fertilizer and your clothes and your food and your housing, everything for that entire year at rates as high as 70% per annum. And in some cases, if you fell ill and could not do your work, they could outsource it to someone else and then charge it to you. So effectively, what is happening there is that white farmer sets your cost structure or your expenses, right? Now, at the end of the season, when you bring the crops to market, what you need to understand is the small white farmer is the market. He tells you what your crops are worth, which means that he sets your revenue or your income. And if someone controls your revenue and they control your expenses, by definition, that means they control your profit. I think you see where I'm going with this 100% tax, right? Now, if you're fortunate, your profit will be zero. If you are unfortunate because they don't want you to go to someone else who's more generous, then your profit will be negative, which means you owe them. And they will roll that into what you owe them for the next year. And that leads to perpetual debt servitude. Now, I am very well aware of what you're thinking right now. And what you're thinking right now is, Shawn, that's a bad deal. I'm not going to take that deal. You like apples? How you like them apples? And I'm with you on that. It's a bad deal. But here's the problem if you don't take that deal. They got a law for that. And those laws say that if you cannot prove that you are a landowner and you cannot prove that you are gainfully employed, you will be charged with a criminal offense and put in a state or county jail. Now you're going to be like, all right, well, I didn't know that part. So I'll sign a contract. But you know what? I'm just not going to do the work. The problem with that is that they got a law for that. And those laws are called contract enforcement laws because you signed an employment contract. And if you break that, they can charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail. Now, some of you might be thinking, look, I didn't realize that either, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to sit in jail. They're going to feed me 3 square meals a day. And when they get tired of that, they can let me out because I'm not doing it because it's a bad deal. And they got something for that. And that's called convict leasing, which means that they will lease you back to the very same small white farmer that you did not want to work for or to a private corporation. And if you take that deal, there's one thing I want you to understand. There is one aspect of convict leasing that you could argue is even worse than slavery, just this one, which is that while a slave owner will kill you and will beat you within an inch of your life, they would prefer to have you around for another 10 or 15 or 20 years to maximize their return on their investment. They have what's known as an interest in your residual value, right? Under convict leasing, there is no such interest. I care not about you 10 years from now. I care about you only for the terms which you are working for me. 6 months, 8 months, 18 months, 24 months. That is it. And under those conditions, you have mortality rates that are approaching 50%, which means you have a 1 in 2 chance of death associated with that. The other thing you have to realize is, as horrible as it sounds, it's incredibly profitable. You're a small white farmer, you can afford a whole slave. Slaves are expensive. You could rent one at a fraction of the cost. Treat them however you want it. It's incredibly lucrative. In 1914, the state of Alabama, 20% of their revenues were coming from convict leasing alone. And what's interesting about this is this isn't a bad 3 or 5 year period. This isn't a bad decade that we went through. This thing lasted for 75 years. And over the course of that time, 4,000 Black people were lynched. This is that we know of, right? That's publicly executed by your fellow American. It is the equivalent of one Black person being executed per week for 75 years. Under those conditions, you will get the hint. Your family will get the hint. Your community will get the hint. Nobody's been prosecuted for these things. So I think you see where the 100% tax on the labor is coming from. And if it is 100% tax on the labor, that means that by definition, it is slavery, which is why they call it slavery by another name. Now, if during the period of actual legal bondage, 50 trillion was extracted for those folks, and now they extended that another 75 years, which is about a third of the time, you can argue that another 15 trillion was extracted from these people. And what you have to remember is that while there were 4 million Black people in the fields in 1860, 1935, you still had 4 million Black people in the fields, value being extracted under these conditions. So let's think about the implication of that. That means that upon emancipation, the white slaveholding power structure lost $22 trillion, equivalent to today's dollars, gone. But then over the next 75 years, they would proceed to claw back 15 trillion from the descendants of these newly freed people. How does one accumulate wealth under these circumstances? Jim Crow period. So now you can say, listen, wow, that was significant. And that's, I didn't know that, right? What I do know is that, not everybody was under Jim Crow. Some people got an education. W.E.B. Du Bois went to Harvard, right? So some people got an education. So let's talk about education. I would say, yeah, you're right. Education is the great equalizer. We call it in today's parlance, human capital development, snazzy name, right? Associated with that. But here's the problem, is that upon emancipation, the white planter class was interested in cheap, abundant labor. They were not interested in public education. Now, small white farmers were absolutely interested in the creation and expansion of public education for their children, as they should be. Newly freed people were absolutely interested in the creation and expansion of public education for themselves and their children, as they should be. White planters, not so much. They educated their children privately. But what they did need was the support of the small white farmer. So they agreed to expand public education, but that they would divert resources from Black children to white children. So W.E.B. Du Bois says that in the 40 years since emancipation, Negro taxes and the Negro share of income from indirect taxes and endowments have fully repaid white investment in the Negro's education. That's how little on net was invested, right? In 1914, a gentleman by the name of William H. Baldwin, who was the president of something called the General Education Board, you can think of that as the Department of Education at the federal level. He said the South needed Negroes educated so they could be the best possible laborers, and that with the right kind of education, Negroes will willingly work menial jobs and this will open up opportunities for Southern whites to work more expert labor. This is a person who's responsible for education, right? For the descendants of newly free people. By 1917, there are about 64 public high schools across the entire South. Not in a county, not in a state, the South, right? Not a whole lot of investment in human capital development. Most of the schools in the K through 12 system are built and owned by Black people. So it's a form of double taxation. Now, in New York City in 1920, they are investing per child about 50 times more than a Black child is receiving in South Carolina under segregation. 50 times more. What I want you to understand about that, and at the time, New York City is about 97 point something percent white. It's not nearly as diverse as you conceive it now. What that means is that you could come from another country to this country, by Ellis Island. And if you stayed in New York, while you came with no resources, you were going into a system that was investing 50 times more in you and your children, their human capital development, than a Black child was getting in South Carolina, whose parents had been here and people before him had been here for hundreds of years, right? Just a massive difference. In the South, for every dollar invested in a Black child, you have 5 to 8 invested to educate a white child. Not rocket science. If you do that with your children, one's going to be a pauper, one's going to Harvard, right? Black teachers in the South are being paid 25 to 34% on the dollar of what white teachers are being paid. Tough to accumulate wealth under those situations. White students are receiving 50% more years of education by the time they're 25. Massive differential in investment in human capital. It is so substantial that researchers say, listen, if you had just invested in the children the same, just keep all the discrimination and stuff in the marketplace, just invested in the children the same, that could have cut the income gap by up to 50%. Just doing that, just doing what the law actually said. So when you start talking about this happening across millions of children for up to 90 years, in a generation, you're talking about over $600 billion of financial impact. And across that period of time, you're talking about up to $3 trillion. So there is a cost to discrimination. Now you can say, listen, I hear you. However, back in the day, you didn't really need an education. We all have a story about a grandfather or a great grandfather in our family that had a fifth grade level education, a terrific work ethic, got a home, raised the family, did well. We all have experiences like that. So you didn't really need an education. So all you needed was really hard work and purchasing of a home. And you could have done really well. What happened there? And I think that's a really great point. And we could talk a little bit about that, because housing is the great wealth builder. It absolutely is, for everyone in particular, and for African Americans, for everyone in general, for African Americans in particular, right? Because about 64% of the net worth of the typical African American family is associated with real estate. It's critically important. It's actually really important to the country. The American dream is home ownership. The government invested heavily in helping Americans achieve that dream. I think that's a wonderful and terrific and noble thing. It is a massive reason why you have such a large middle class. They invested about $120 billion. Back in the day, it's the equivalent of about $1 trillion today. Here's the problem. Less than 2%, and substantially less than 2% of any of those resources invested went to any Black family. Right? So I'm sure you guys have heard about, FHA and redlining, right? I won't go into a lot of detail about that. But the federal government invented the mortgage as we know it, right? And what they did was they just guaranteed the payments. That lowered the risk and allowed banks to take lower deposits and to spread out the payment over up to 30 years, right? It allowed millions of people to purchase a home that they could otherwise never afford, right? Only problem is that they refused to guarantee loans for African Americans and absolutely for African Americans who wanted to live in white communities. They were afraid of what they called neighborhood stability. Now you can say, well, I'll just talk to the bank directly. The bank also refused, or the banks also refuse to lend to African Americans. You can say, well, I'll talk to the builder. We'll work it out. Builders also refused. And the banks and the builders had another problem, which is that the federal government wouldn't guarantee their loans if they didn't refuse. And then you can say, I'm going to talk to the realtor. We'll work it out. They'll help me find something. Unfortunately, realtors, real estate agents refuse to participate in these transactions. And you can say, listen, we'll just talk to our fellow American. We'll work it out, right? Person to person. And unfortunately, residents signed covenants amongst themselves that said, if you ever sell from this community, that you will sell to a person who is, Caucasian or of European descent. So you've got a complete phalanx, right? Now you can say, look, that sounds super duper qualitative. I would say you're right. The data's in the book. But what I can say quite definitively is that less than 1% of all mortgages issued in the United States of America between 1930 and 1960 went to Black people. There's no greater wealth builder. There's nothing more important than less than 1%. Now you can say, look, I get it. And one thing to think about is if you can't get a mortgage, it doesn't mean that you don't want a home. You still want the American dream. So what people started to do was they turned to the private markets under something called contract sales. And private markets are unregulated. So what happens in these markets is you don't have to do appraisals. So homes are being sold at like 2x the value. On top of that, there's astronomical interest rates. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that you don't build equity in the house as you make your payments. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. Let's say we make an agreement that I'm going to purchase the home from you and that I'm going to make 100 installment payments before I take ownership of it, right? And I make 99 of those payments and I miss the 100. What it allows you to do is to keep all 99 payments, to keep my down payment, to take back the house, to evict me, and to resell the house to someone else. You earn no equity in the house, and you are responsible for the upkeep and maintenance of those homes by that contract. How do people accumulate wealth under these circumstances? Now, you can say, look, it's a terrible period. You can buckle down and just, work your best and save your money, right? In the place where you're renting and kind of wait for some of this craziness to blow over. You know what I mean? But here's the problem with that. We're talking about a time at which you have many millions of people fleeing the South and being forced into these corralled areas that they call urban ghettos. Ghetto means involuntary, by the way, connotation. What happens when the demand for space is going up and the amount of space is not going up? The price of the space goes up, right? So it turns out that in those impoverished urban ghetto communities, the rent is more than 50% higher than outside of those communities. you can't even save money in there. How does one accumulate wealth under these circumstances? And if you say, look, just work hard, economists have looked at labor market discrimination, and some have put that number at 1.6 trillion. Those are $1983. If you look at today's equivalent, you're talking about over $4 trillion. So extremely difficult to earn and to retain income under these circumstances. So this helps to explain why, white Americans born between 1943 and 1951, my mother's born in 1946, would go on to accumulate 11 times more wealth than a Black American born in that same period. A lot of people think that's strictly a matter of hard work. Just want to provide a little bit of context around that. Now, so when you talk about housing and labor market, you see the numbers are staggering. Now, I'm not going to have time to kind of go through the New Deal or the GI Bill, which is over $1 trillion injected into the economy. I won't have time to talk about the interstate highway investment, which is pushing over $6 billion in today's equivalent, right? And they ran many of these highways through Black communities, by the way, thriving Black communities. And I won't have enough time to talk about kind of post-civil rights till now. But all of that is covered in the book, which you will get before you leave. So where are we now? The Black community has $1.5 trillion less in revenue than we otherwise should relative to our portion of the population. $1 trillion of that is associated with business income, 520 billion associated with personal income, right? We talked about the missing net worth. We talked about the 6 million jobs and 1.4 million businesses with employees that are missing. Get a sense of how it's been difficult to invest in those things. And we're trapped in this thing that I call like a 2% economic framework. Now, when I was doing research for the book, this number 2% kept coming up again and again and again and again. And it turned out that in areas really critical to wealth accumulation, we seem to be hovering around 2% representation. So less than 2% of corporate supply chain spend is spent on Black enterprise. Less than 2% of government supply chain spend is spent on Black enterprise. Less than 2% of African American spend, right? So we do a horrible job of spending money on our own businesses. And then when you think about really high growth, high paying occupations, whether it's in the tech sector or it's in Silicon Valley or it's, management at the, in the financial industry, so on and so forth, our representation tends to be around 2%. Thinking about STEM careers, tends to be around, 2%. Black doctors, 2% of Black males, so on and so forth. It goes on. There's a couple pages I dedicate just to the occurrence of these things. In terms of our deposits in banks, we less than 2% is in Black financial enterprises. Actually, if you look at the U.S. banking system, only $4 out of every $10,000 in the banking system is in a Black bank. There's just simply not enough capital in those banks to provide the loans. So deposits in those banks to provide the capital for businesses. Less than 2% of SBA loans goes to Black enterprise. It's actually a lot less than 2%. So all of this provides a really negative impact, depressive impact on job creation and business development in the Black community. So you can get a real sense of how is it that after all this time, we're only at a point of accumulating about 2% of U.S. wealth, right? One of the things I want to talk about really quickly is what was lost. That's the cost to Black people, right? But what was lost by the country from not taking advantage of fully integrating Black talent and excellence into the economy? And I want to look at it from an innovation standpoint, right? So that period from 1870 to 1945 that we talked about, that Jim Crow period, that's also the heart of the Industrial Revolution. You have 2.5 million patents are created during that period of time. We're talking about telephones and light bulbs and semiconductors and airplanes and automobiles, transistors, the things that are fundamental for the growth of our economy right now, all created during that time. How many patents were created by African Americans during that time? Black people. 726. Millions and millions and millions. What's the opportunity cost of that? So, why is this important? Samuel Kortum from Yale University says that a constant flow of new patents, innovation, can generate a constant rate of economic growth. It's super critical to the growth and expansion of economies. The Brookings Institute has talked about the impact of unequal access to education, human capital development, depriving the innovation system of the number of people that otherwise might be making or commercializing important discoveries, right? It's a big deal. And given that talent generally follows like a normal distribution, like 70% of people tend to be in the middle, right? Average to good. 15% tend to be awesome. I call them the ultra brilliant. We all like to think we're in that category. 15% are very much below average. So one of the things to think about is, what was the size of that ultra brilliant population over the course of that time, right? In 1870, you're talking about 730,000 Black people. 1900, you're talking about 1.3 million. 1930, you're talking about almost 1.8 million. And 1950, you're talking about 2.3 million. What were these folks doing in 1870? Sharecropping. What were these folks doing in 1900? Sharecropping. Very few got the education that we all talk about. What were these folks doing in 1930? You guys still have 4 million people in the fields during this time. 1950, 1948, only 1.6% of African Americans have a college degree. What is happening to this ultra brilliant talent? And if it had been put to use in the innovation system, what we would be looking at, and not using them, is called misallocation. We'd be looking at another 280,000 patents. Now, that's directly proportional to economic growth and development, right? No innovation, no America as we know it. You're talking about over $2 trillion in national income that we don't have now, year over year. You're talking about over $9 trillion in net worth that we don't have now. Now, a researcher from Michigan State University, did a really interesting study. She asked this, I thought was a profound question, which is, what would have happened to innovation if white Americans had experienced the level of trauma that Black Americans experienced during that Jim Crow period? It's a really profound question. And her research says that 40% of the patents would have never been created. You don't do discoveries in trauma. You need time and space to focus on stuff like that, right? 40% of the patents, that's 1 million patents. Which of these things would be infected by that? Telephones and light bulbs and photocopiers, movies and transistors and so on and so forth. What would be the economic impact in terms of revenue? You're talking about over $7 trillion of revenue for the country at risk, and over $30 trillion in net wealth, right? Having talented people involved in the innovation process is super critical. That's why all you guys are here. You're going to be working on that in some way, shape, or form, right? And we're all going to be the better for it. So, the point that I wanted to make there is that the costs are substantial. It's just not a matter of people not working hard, right? I want us to have some context. This isn't Hollywood where you parachute in. If it were you would have had some kind of different outcome. That's not how it was designed to work. And there's not just costs to African Americans, which were massive and hard to conceive. There's also costs to the whole country for what was done and continues to be done. And I'll kind of, end with this quote, which was from, it was given at the United Nations by Emperor Haile Selassie, in 1963. He said the basis for racial discrimination has been economic, right? And it's with economics that these evils will be overcome, right? So with that said, let's kind of stop here and talk about what some of the economic solutions could be and answer some of your questions. Thank you very much. Yes.
Fred Davis, class of 81 here at Hofstra University, also a member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. So what you said is phenomenal, first of all. I mean, just incredible. And I did read the book. Do you believe in wealth redistribution so that what had happened to the Black community can at least in portion be rectified? And if you do, in what way should that happen?
So the question is, do you believe in wealth distribution?
Right.
And in the impact that it will have, and in what way should it be done? That's a profound question, right? So the short version is yes, right? It's a very necessary component, right? The other question is, in what way should it be done? And before we go to that way, what I'm trying to do is increase the quality of discourse so we can evolve from why are we having this conversation to wow, what can we do about this? Then we can start to talk about the most effective ways to address this, right? So let me talk about a couple different things in speaking to this question. What I propose and advocate as the immediate start now solution is this framework that I call PhD, right? And PhD is very simple. It stands for purchase, hire, deposit in ways that create jobs and businesses in the Black community. And I'll tell you why I say Black community specifically, right? So when you start talking about purchase, that component of it, that's what we spend as consumers. And we have full discretion over that. And if you start with just African Americans, we do a particularly poor job of doing business with our own enterprises, right? I think we're at 2%, which means we're 98% isn't. The last time I checked, 98% was excellent. We're excellent at not doing business with each other. That's not a winning strategy, right? So it's shifting that spend for the purpose of creating jobs. But it's not just African Americans, it's anyone else who believes in economic development and the creation of jobs to solve problems. That's at an individual level. That's your consumer spend. At a corporate level, at a government level, at an organizational level, institution, that's your supply chain spend. All organizations have to buy products and services to achieve their strategic imperatives, whatever they happen to be, right? You're talking about the federal government's $600 billion, right? Corporations, it's a massive amount. Less than 2% of any of that is being spent on Black enterprise, right? Small changes in that spend can create enormous amounts of job creating opportunities across like the Black community. And the idea here is very specifically like, if you want to show allyship and support this, that, and the other, do it with your money and your economics. The organization, the institution, the government, so on and so forth should do that, right? It's a powerful net benefit. The other portion is the higher piece of it, which is that we should be properly reflected on the payroll of corporations in general and governments, right, as well, particularly those corporations that benefit quite dramatically from our patronage, right? How you show solidarity, support, whatnot, is by how much of your payroll is actually going to the communities that are sowing and seeding into you. It creates jobs. It's super, super critical. And then you have deposits, which is banks. Their job is to provide lending, to provide credit. right? It's primarily business lending, right? And then it's also consumer lending. And Black enterprise doesn't have enough deposits to provide that lending, right? And that's super, super critical. And there is significant discrimination, according to research, in the lending that's happening now and historically from majority banks. And that's putting negative capital pressures on banks. So PhD is a really important part of that. And that's what we can do now. You don't need any government program to get that changing, right? You just share with people what matters to you. Don't just kind of write a check to a nonprofit, keep doing it, double down on it, but don't do that if you control a $15 billion supply chain. Do business with enterprise that creates jobs. Families are based on the ability to feed now and have something left over for the future, and communities are milled up of families. There's no more powerful thing that can be done than to create jobs and businesses in the Black community. In particular, that has to be done. The second thing I'll say is, if you fast forward it and just did the redistribution right now, let's just fast forward straight to it, right? What would happen is it will be a massive stimulus for the rest of the economy. People are so caught up in their kind of bigoted thinking that they don't even realize that it all flows out. We've not been allowed to develop the infrastructure to retain it. People are going to buy cars, going to buy all kinds of different things. We don't own those things, and we're not properly reflected on their payroll supply chain. So most of that benefit goes to someone else. So you want to do both, right? Put this in place and then also advocate for that. Yes. Oh.
Hi, my name is Nia Arrington Seward. I'm from the Kappa Phi chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated here on campus. And my question to you is, we're all college-age students. We're getting ready to graduate and start our economic future and legacy. What is your advice to Black students who are getting ready to start businesses and who want to go out there and do something different about the racial discrimination based on economics?
That's a great question. That's a big question, right? So I'll take a stab at that. I would say there's a number of things that you need to do. Part of it is we all make enormous mistakes when we graduate from university, right? Black, white, kind of different. The Black community doesn't have the ability to absorb those mistakes, right? And so one of the things that you have to do, we all have to do, is you have to maximize your ability to retain income. You guys are going to graduate with great jobs into a society that values looking well, but not being well financially, right? You got to have a budget. You got to have a plan. You got to know what your free cash flow is. And then you've got to allocate that cash flow in ways that increases the assets that you have and puts you in a maximum position to maximize the resources that you will have when you retire. 56% of entrepreneurs are self-funding, right? Like, this is what I'm trying to explain to people, right? And so we don't have these generational things coming. So the income that you're getting, you're going to have to make sure that you have a plan, you have a budget, you're maximizing your cash flow, you're minimizing debt, and you're maximizing all investment, retirement investment opportunities. Super, super, super critical. Got to be done. No cash flow, no conversation. We're done here, right? The other thing is applying PhD. A PhD is very simple. When possible, where possible, utilize high quality Black products and services, right? Who's your realtor? You know what I mean? Who's going to be your financial person? Who's going to be your insurance person? Who's going to be your doctor, dentist, so on and so forth? These are accountants, clearly, right? These are super critical, high paying jobs and services. They're never going anywhere. They're going to be here. They support families in a phenomenal way. And we do not utilize these things as a people. And I think it puts us in a really bad situation to not be doing what we would want other people to do, right? So those are two things that I would say. And then the third thing is I would encourage you to encourage others to do the same. That's how you show solidarity, support, allyship, whatever the word is that people want to express. Now, I'll give you a quick example of how I think about things and how a PhD mindset works, right? I'm sure you guys remember a think two or three summers ago, you had a rash of massive police shootings, right? With the murder of unarmed, black men um, and women, and you had a lot of solidarity in New York City. I think you had like 25,000 people marching up and down like Fifth Avenue. It was a beautiful thing, like arm in arm. It was a wonderful thing to behold. You know what I'm saying? And people saw that. You know what I saw? I saw $3 billion of income. And not a nickel of that was going to be spent the day after that to create jobs and businesses and expand those businesses. That's what we need to do, right? To circumvent some of these problems. So that's what I would say in a short time that I have.
Speaking of cash flow,
Yeah.
actually, first and foremost, thank you for the Brothers of Side Chapter for having this event and having you share, brother Rochester, and
Thank you.
onward and upward for those brothers that are in the room. Um, speaking of cash flow, I've been in insurance and financial services for the past 18 years.
Mhm.
And I get a lot of opposition because I believe that insurance, specifically permanent insurance, is a cornerstone for building wealth,
Mhm.
especially as a way to close the racial wealth gap that exists.
Mhm.
So when you talk about PhD, I'm totally, I'm totally open to that, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. But when it comes to insurance products and that as a potential solution to close the gap, I get a lot of opposition. Buy term and invest the rest. What are your thoughts around that in terms of building wealth through insurance products?
Yeah. So I won't get into the specifics, right, of term kind of versus permanent. I'll just talk about insurance in general, right? Insurance is what I call the "what if I don't make it" plan, right? Because what I talked about was putting together a plan where you will be here in the future, right? And that you will be able to leave a financial legacy for your children. But insurance is a super critical part of that, which is what if I don't make it for whatever reasons? That needs to be in place. Many people do not have that in place. That's just an education that needs to happen. It's what I call personal financial management. This stuff isn't taught in schools. It's not taught in our churches. It's not taught in like K through 12, right? And because of a lot of historical trauma, financial trauma that we've been through, we don't have a critical mass of that knowledge and information in our families and communities to be able to pass it on. So you do need to have a specific investment in helping people understand the importance of these things, right? That's the insurance in general. The secondary issue that you have to be concerned with and cognizant of is that I didn't talk about it in this presentation. I talk about it in the book, right? Which is the bias levels in America extremely high against African Americans, right? And you can look at the studies from Harvard, Stanford, Chicago, all this kind of stuff, right? It goes from high to really high. And African Americans have that same bias against ourselves, right? So if you look at like the unconscious bias, it's almost 8 and 10, like 75-ish%, right? Which is a significant problem. We have that bias against ourselves. So the other problem is, and our bias tends to show up in commerce. We'll help each other in all kinds of different ways, but we don't really do business with each other, right? You'll sit in church next to this person and you'll do business with everyone else. And that's also part of what's kind of going in the mix, right? And one of the things that I want to encourage and address is if we want to solve these big problems, let's do it economically, and let's do it by facilitating business and commerce. And you and others like you should be part of the pool of service providers that we are using and that we're looking at that we're not doing, right? And we could talk like I've run all kinds of calculations on a bunch of different things. I could tell you how many jobs would be created if we use Black realtors, plus all of the support professionals that go along with the closing process is actually quite significant. And that's got to be a super important part of the process, right? So it doesn't get into like, the one product versus another, right? But many people don't even have it. And many people think of stuff like 401ks and retirement vehicles as an expense, right? Like that's a a must-have, right? So it's an education process that has to go along with it. Yes.
Dear brother, please stay still. I know this brother. I actually brought him into the chapter. My name is Alan Best. I'm actually an alumni here, 1995. I am a brother of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. Brother, thank you very much for taking your time out and bringing this information to us today.
Thank you.
One thing that you had up there was the Homestead Act.
Yeah.
And you stated that if every family could have gotten back $1 million, then we can actually overcome this past discrimination that we had. Am I correct?
Well, what I stated was the equivalent value in today's dollars of those distributions per family was the equivalent of $1 million. That's a hell of a start.
And I'm sure with everyone in this room, we played the lotto and we was hoping that we had that 1.6 billion, or at least we had that $1 million that was going to be taxed anyway, right? But, you know, we went through the past from like the 1800s all the way up. And if we as people say, how are we going to catch up? And this is kind of a statement, not a question. I want you to comment on it later on. But if we actually look at ourselves as the past that will be helping the future, how can we take and say, well, how can we make that child or that family have that $1 million? And I believe that brother right there has the answer through life insurance. Something that if, for God forsake, you go or you have a child, you know, I'm going to let him, because we had the conversation. I know you know what I'm going to, but if you have a child and as soon as that child is born and has a social security number, you get him a whole life insurance. And you pay, you don't actually go out there and you don't have the BMW, but you have a Hyundai, and maybe you pay over a certain period of time. You know, the young lady said, well, what do I do when I get out of college? You're going to be creating your life. You're going to have a family. Sooner or later, you're going to be creating something that's going forward. If you just pay a little bit towards that insurance for that child or someone you know, once they get that social security number, I promise you, when they're standing here at my age, they'll be a millionaire. You know, through that insurance that they have, that whole life insurance that they have. And it goes into the factor of you can take money off of that and you can pay for their education if you know, and without anyone dying. Without anyone dying. We haven't even talked about the qualities of life of debt, where they'll actually receive another $1 million on top of that. You know, they can be multi-millionaires if you die or if they die, you know, regardless of the factor. You know, this is something that I looked at the Homestead Act and I said, well, this can actually catch us up. And if people knew about this, it could kind of catch us up to where it has to be. You know, I did it in the late years and I did it for my children. And I'm not saying that they're millionaires. They're not. Far from it, because I told you I did it in the late years. But if I decided to have another child tomorrow, that child will be a millionaire by the time they're 21 through insurance and no taxes. How do you feel about that, brother?
I'm a proponent of both and all of the above. I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think that is an important pillar, right, in creating wealth with everything else. What we have to do, like, I have a engineering strategy type of background, so I'm always designing for the outcomes that I want, right? So you gotta put something together to get to that outcome. And you have to understand like the frame that's happening here, right? So if you start thinking like between ages of 25 and 55, prime working age, 35%, up until 2014, a Black male earned zero income. Somebody has to fund that, right? Yeah. Right. So here's the thing. We haven't done a deep dive on the solutions. The reason we haven't done that is there's no point in that if people don't see a problem. That is where we are. You're trying to solve a problem that other people don't recognize, or they think it's your problem. And if it's your problem, why do I have to pay for it? Why do I have to suffer through it? Why do I have to sacrifice? As far as I can see, you did this to yourself. And you've been free, and you've been this, and you've been that. And when will you be able to stand on your own? And this is positioned again and again and again, and people seem not prepared to speak to it in a quantitative way. They speak to it in an emotional way. Let me break something to you. Nobody cares how you feel. They don't care about your feelings. They care about your skill set. They care about your ability to add value. And that's that they can get past their conscious or subconscious bias, which we have not gotten into, right? All of these things are part of the problem, right? It is a multivariate solution. It can be solved, right? And it's having people at the table who recognize the problem and are talking about what are the ways in which we can do this. There are programs that work now that are underfunded. There are programs that haven't been put in place that could be put in place, right? So the first step for me is to help people have the same fact pattern, right? People say, oh, slavery was a long time ago. It's not that big a deal. Okay. Before you get the information, sounds perfectly sensible. After you get the information, tough statement to make, right? Now we can start working through what some of these problems are, right? We haven't talked about the bias that goes into how work product is evaluated for like attorneys. You're talking the highest level kind of capability. We haven't talked about the differential in what Black doctors make to white doctors. Everything accounted for except race. Like we haven't talked about the billions of dollars that actually are showing up in attacks today, right now, how that could be alleviated. Because those things can fund a lot of the stuff that we're talking about. So this is like a multi-part discussion that we need to have. And so I'm with you, chomping at the bit to solve it, right? But we can work on that once we got people rowing in the same direction, right? And there's a lot of people to get the information that have impact and authority that's really large that can be very helpful. They can be accelerators and catalysts to the very things that you're talking about. So, but we can talk further kind of offline. Yes.
Okay. I'm Brenda. I'm a real estate investor, and I also work for local government here in Nassau County.
Mhm.
Your book seems familiar. It's similar to something that's in Claude Anderson's book.
Mhm.
And I want your opinion. Are you familiar with Dr. Claude Anderson?
Yes, I am.
And also, with my property investing, I deal with a large circle of Black people that make very well money, but
Mhm.
they kind of leave the community.
Mhm.
And then the great money that they make leaves their pockets because
Right.
they keep searching for something more and more, which they feel is better,
Mhm.
but their wealth leaves their pockets. So,
Yep.
what is your opinion on that, and your opinion with Dr. Claude Anderson, and also with Powernomics? What do you think?
So I'm familiar with Dr. Anderson. One of my fraternity brothers told me about him when I was an undergrad. I read his book. I was like, wow,
Okay.
right? For sure. What is different about my book is I go into detail on the financial cost and implication. It's a thin book and it'll be a quick read because I don't talk about things that I can't substantiate with research and data.
Okay.
Right? And to my knowledge and to everybody else I've talked to, nobody's done that before. It's a particularly unique and profound read. And it's
Okay.
designed to paradigm shift, to change minds, because I ultimately want to change actions. In terms of, you know, what you're observing with, wealthy African Americans kind of moving out of the community, that's a much larger macroeconomic problem that we could talk about, right? What you have to remember is the structure of that was created in what I just walked you through, right? Like the communities that we live in, we did not create. We did not architect. We did not design. We made it home. but that's not what our homes should be, right? People are moving to places where the resources are more substantial, right? Where you have great jobs and industry and economic opportunities, you have great schools. There's no place where that continuum like doesn't exist. The problem, there's multiple problems here, right? The first thing is as people leave, because their money is not in Black financial institutions, the capital is leaving with them. If their money was in institutions, the capital wouldn't be leaving with them. It would still be available, right? So that's part of that's the D in PhD. If you're not doing that, you're not going to circulate anything, right? So you know how people talk about the velocity of money, how it stays in communities for different times. The people that we admire most, right, like our Jewish brothers and sisters, our Asian brothers and sisters, our Latino brothers and sisters, they do PhD. I'm just giving it a name. That's what we admire, right? I mean, they spend and deposit, right, and hire in ways that create jobs and businesses in their community as they should. We don't. There's structural reasons why that's the case. We're prevented from doing that, and we're living with that legacy now, and we're trying to turn that around. People generally move to where economic conditions are better, and unfortunately, economic conditions are typically better outside of Black communities that were kind of made for us in the community, that were made for us in this country. And what I'm trying to do is reverse that process, right? We have a massive jobs problem, right? And when you don't have jobs, you don't have income. Like this, families are based on the ability for you to earn decent income, cover certain costs, and have something left for the future. When those things are hollowed out, see, like we didn't get a chance to really talk through how we got here from like the 40s, 50s, and 60s to show all this stuff where it would be much clearer. Then we have to talk about how do you get people to come back and what's the process, for doing that. So I won't be able to answer that and kind of go into it because I would have to go through a bunch of other stuff to do it, but we can talk offline more about that. Okay.
This guy.
Yeah.
How you doing? My name is Andrew. I learned a lot today.
Thank you.
I didn't expect to learn so much. No offense, but I have heard constantly. It seems the thing that makes this the most complicated to me, and it's the money. People's money. They touch their money, and even in a Black community per se, or any community, if you go to Flushing, you know where to. If you go to a store, you know you're putting money in whose hand. I live in Queens. Even in Queens, I go to a store that's selling stuff from my culture, but it's not owned by my people.
Right.
And there's nowhere around where I go into a store and I know it's owned by that kind of person. And it's essentially even a Jamaican store. It's not owned by. I've spoken to them, and it's not owned by someone of my culture. So finding where to reinvest the money, even if that is my intention, is its own problem and its own complication that I kind of don't see an answer to. But then, with the age of the internet and everything going now, to another place I can't see, where do you fix that problem as well? Like, where does the money not hemorrhage everywhere else as opposed to finding its way into our community?
Right.
So we can stop, like you said, stop the bleeding. Even though you change the mind, what happens to the mind when you can't find a place to put the money?
Right. I would sum that into what do I do now? I get it. Right. You're like, I get it. I got it. I want to do what you're saying. How do I do it? Because these businesses and enterprises, so on and so forth, are not around. They're providing services, but they're not owned by us, right? So again, I go back to this like PhD framework. Part of what we all need to be aware of is that African Americans have well over $100 billion deposited in banks across the country. Very little of that is in Black financial institutions who tend to lend to African Americans in a far less discriminatory framework. So the moving of your deposits into these institutions to capitalize them to provide the loan. You need money to start a business, right? Now, studies have been done that say that the current Black businesses, the current ones right now, require up to about $9 trillion of additional credit. That is what they're saying that they needed and they're not getting, right? And almost 8 out of 10 of them say that if they had access to credit, they would hire. So moving a small portion of our money into those banks could provide the capital to be able to lend to far more businesses so they can actually have the resources to start the businesses that you're looking for. We can do that. Our friends, allies, corporations, companies, so on and so forth can do that. It's a critical step, right? The other piece of what I think you talked about was identifying where these businesses are. And there's a lot of people working on that, right? You've got, the Dubai Black communities, and they're trying to utilize social media and the digital age to identify where all these businesses are so that we can spend on them. And that needs to be done as well. So here's the thing I want us to start, right? We're not trying to boil the ocean, and we're not trying to eat the whole elephant today. You got to start with, when possible, where possible, what can I do? And the first thing that we can do is the resources that we control, when possible, where possible, use Black talent. You increase demand for them. My goal is to increase demand where they're oversubscribed and they have to hire, right? Every job affects a family, every family affects a community, so on and so forth. It has to start there. We cannot, as a people, be asking all these questions and maintain a 98% non-spend on our own businesses. That's a non-starter, right? So where you buy your car, when you get your car, matters. You have total control over doing that. I buy my car from a Black dealer. Dealers have terrific jobs. It's a really critical, important thing, right? I try to use, Black realtors. I don't want to pay any of these fees, but I have to. I try to make sure that families are eating if that's the case. Doctors, dentists, so on and so forth, right? These are things that we have, control over that we should try to do. Just had to buy braces for the kids. I don't want to spend money on braces, right? They're really expensive. I looked across my whole state. I didn't know where, there was like a Black orthodontist. I had no idea, but I did a back of the envelope and I figured we're probably spending about $1.6 billion on that. Think about how many businesses that are not existing, right? How many families, communities, churches, so on and so forth that are not there. So let's just, we take it, one step at a time, which is, what do we do with our own resources? And then how do we encourage others to do it? And how do we show institutions and corporations that this is the way to do it? Don't just put us in a commercial. Make sure we're on your supply chain. Make sure that we're on your payroll. Make sure you're putting money in our institutions. Everything else is just symbolic and it's a shiny object. We got to be careful of shiny objects.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Coates. Thank you, Brother Rochester, for attending, being at this event tonight. I'm Michael Coates. I'm the Xi Psi Affinity Chapter President. Left Hofstra 2007 and part of the Alumni Association. So I just wanted to thank everyone for being here, and I'll talk more shortly about some things. But I just wanted to get to I had a couple questions, Brother Rochester. It's kind of 3 questions, and you could answer them at a high level. And then I know you was talking about your PhD methodology. Yep. But my first question is, one, how can I personally just sweep my own porch? Meaning I have friends that are very successful. So how do we bring consciousness to someone who's one of our friends who's a person of color, and they go to Harvard, they come out, they work at a big firm, Goldman Sachs, Cravath, Swaine and Moore. They're making $200K, and then they kind of just go out in the abyss. And consciousness, meaning like, how do we make them realize, spend Black and hire Black? Because I see that too many times, someone, they're very successful and it's like things are going well for them and they kind of just get lost in the abyss and forget about everything we just spoke about. So that's one. A subset of that is even people who work in key positions. How do I bring our consciousness to them? For example, I know someone who works at a pretty prestigious law firm, top 3 law firm. Law firm's worth $1 billion. They're head of diversity. And to them, it's just a job. But I'm like, you're in a key position, probably to hire, do really good because you do have a budget, and that budget could impact, as you said, Black-owned businesses, and also it could hire people. So that's kind of just one question. The second question would be, how do we get past the subconscious bias? Because I do notice that, and that is huge. And I've been speaking to people about that recently, and they kind of look at me like, huh, what are you talking about? And I'm like, it's real, because when you get support, for example, we did a run, and the run was, it was to raise, scholarship funds for people of color, especially here at Hofstra University. And, we knock on the door saying, hey, listen, brothers and sisters, we need your support. And then they don't show up to the degree that we expect. And then there are some other organizations that we did very little promotion to, and they came out, and I was just like, wow, we can't even get our own people out. It's kind of sad. It's very sad, because, you've been promoting to them, and they just don't show up. The third question, totally unrelated to question 1 and 2, is the supply spending. I noticed I work at Mitchell Titus, which is the largest minority-owned accounting firm in the country. And, I always read these glamorous articles that say, hey, Coca-Cola spent $2 billion in minority supply chain and MWBE companies. And I'm like, okay, what companies? The article never really breaks down how that spend is. And I'm not sure if it's public information, but I never kind of see it trickle down to some of our organizations.
Right.
And maybe it does. I'm not at the high level meetings, but I work on numerous accounts, so I don't always see the spend come down. So I kind of can use common sense to say, wait a minute, they just spent $2 billion, and we are the largest minority controlled accounting firm. I really don't see the revenue. So what's up? So with that third question is, how can we be more actively involved in knowing or holding these companies accountable versus just glossing over an article saying, oh, they spent $2 trillion and forgetting about it, versus and bring a consciousness and saying, wait a minute, what did they spend the $2 trillion on?
Right.
And who benefited?
Right. So that's a lot to hold in short-term memory. Right. I'm going to boil the first 2 questions down to this. You would like to see different actions, right? But actions follow thinking. So what you have to do is change their perspective, which is what I'm trying to do with this conversation, right? So, I need you in whatever way, and everybody else here, whatever way possible, to amplify the message. The great thing about like me and being an author is, like, people buy many copies of this, buy like 10, 20 copies of it, and they give it to everybody, right? Very few authors can say that kind of thing, because they're like, just read this first, and then let's kind of talk. Again, you want people to see a problem that they don't see. First, just recognize that they don't see it, right? And now work on, how do you get them to see it? How do you have the conversation? How do you get them in the room? Because they don't see a problem, right? So, and having dialogues, having these conversations, I'll be happy to come in and talk to them. I talk to all kinds of different people, and the response generally is, people didn't know this stuff. How are they going to know it? You get the same curriculum as everybody else. It's not in it. You go to church, maybe you do, or house of worship someplace, right? It's not in it. It's not in K through 12. It's not there. It's not something that is kind of socialized in our community. So people don't know, but they know a lot of stuff, other things that they're told. And they believe that. And you got to have a counterbalance. So how do you amplify the message? How do you buy the book, share it, right? Share the talks, you know what I mean? Book clubs, organizations, so on and so forth, because we keep asking people to have conversations on race. What kind of conversation are you going to have when you have the uneducated talking to the ill-informed? We need the same level of fact pattern to talk about it, so people can have understanding and empathy, and then they will start to act differently. Or at least you will identify the ones that are interested in acting differently. The other question that you're talking about, the minority spend, is a bigger discussion. Firstly, you said MWB minority. And one of the things that I say everywhere that I go is that minority does not mean Black. I need to be 100% clear on that. Minority does not mean Black, right? Now, let me give you some examples of this. So if you look at it from a supply chain spend, people say, listen, I want to create jobs and businesses, and I want to do things that are necessary to uplift various communities. So what I'm going to do is we're going to invest in doing more business with women entrepreneurs and women business owners. I think that's dope. I think it's fantastic. I think they should double, triple, quadruple down on that. It's critical and it's necessary, right? Women who own businesses generate about $1.2 trillion. It's phenomenal. It's fantastic. If you ask yourself how much of that is from Black women, it's less than 2%. And I'm interested in how much revenue is going to Black women. So what that means is for every $100 you invest in that, it's not into the $99 that a sister would see it. That's why you really have to be specific, right? Even in the language that we use, minority and diversity and inclusion and these things are generally euphemisms for not white male. You know what's important to understand? When you say not white male, you're talking about 90% of people on planet Earth. It's incredibly non-specific. How do you address specific problems in the least specific way possible? If you say, listen, let's do this by investing in our Latino brothers and sisters, I think it's dope. Double, triple, quadruple down on it, make it happen. How much revenue do they drive? The ones that have employees, it's about $380 billion a year. Ask yourself how much of that is from Black people who identify themselves as Latino. It's less than 2%. Again, it's not until the $99. If you say, let's do it with our Asian brothers and sisters, they generate over $600 billion, right, a year, right, in their businesses. By definition, there's no Black ownership there. So when you look at that total amount of spend that's happening to minority, right, it's about 9% of that is going to Black enterprise. If you put women in it, it's 4%. That's why they don't tell you what the Black numbers are, because they're abysmal. It's much easier to talk about the minority numbers, and that's okay. Like, people are well-meaning and they're trying to do good and all that kind of different stuff. What I'm saying is, if you want to affect positively and profoundly in the Black community, you're going to have to be specific, because the resources don't get to our enterprises. And that is the fact of the matter, right? That's the detail. And people who are responsible for these programs don't know this. You know what I mean? But for everybody else, the layperson says, wow, when they hear minority, they're thinking Black. They're thinking Black people are living it up, boy. Would you say $2 billion? Very little of that is going to Black enterprises, right? The data supports it unequivocally. And then you guys see it empirically. So,
okay. First, thank you for a very powerful presentation. That was really quite good. I've been arguing your basic thesis, the basic tenets of your presentation for years with people of one political persuasion or another, and you get depending upon whether people are a little bit more liberal or less, a basic sympathy towards, yes, we ought to do something, or maybe a little bit less. So at one time or another, maybe that might have been affirmative action or something of that nature. But in the past few years, we've seen an ascendance of the far right to a position of political power. They tend to be less interested in historical economic arguments, and indeed less interested in arguments, period. And on top of that, racist. So you get this kind of a situation, whereas for the last 40, 50 years, there's been, to one extent or another, a basic sympathy as to, yes, we need to do something. Now there's a hardening on the part of the political power structure to almost, we want to do nothing, and maybe we even want to go backwards. So how does your basic approach change to what you're putting forward here in this kind of a situation?
The approach doesn't change, because the aim is to expose people to really important information and context that they can juxtapose with their decision making. There are some people who have chosen to be impervious to facts and information. I don't spend my time on those people, right? Because for every moment that I'm spending with them, I'm not spending a moment on someone who's interested and open and having, an important dialogue. What we have to remember that while that group is small, they're extremely well capitalized. And in a capitalist society, small groups can have a really big impact. But the other thing is that there is a lot of sympathy to their positions, right? Explicit and implicit sympathies. A lot of people feel like, Black folks in particular, minorities in general, and Latinos coming to the country are living high on the hog. And they've been living that way for a long, long time. And it's gotta come to an end. They, from their perspective, their home that their grandfather bought, they did that strictly with hard work. Government subsidization doesn't even come into that. Not possible to put down 100% on that home, 70% on that home, or 50% on that home if the government didn't underwrite that, right? They're not even aware of that, anything else of that narrative. How would they be? Most people generally are not. Like, my goal is to affect people that are open to discussion and conversation to say, wow, I never knew that. Because it does really affect a lot of people. It doesn't have to affect everyone. That's the beauty of this. You don't need everyone. And we're not trying to boil the ocean here. We're trying to move with the people who are interested in moving now, to give them some context and perspective, right? Because they can say, okay, how can I do it as an individual? How can I do it with my company? 60% of small businesses are 50% of all people employed, right? In America. That's vast. That's dominated by white Americans, right? 60% of all small businesses owned by white Americans have 0 Black employees. Not one. Right? You can affect a lot of change if people say, okay, I see the problem and I want in my small way to be able to impact that. So if I can do that by hiring this company or that company, hey, I need the service anyway, I'll do that. As opposed to that company is unqualified and you're forcing me to do it. It's just a different kind of perspective, but I'm not interested in spending time with the intransigent, right? It's just, you'll burn out all your energy, right? Doing that. Let's work with the people who are interested in moving now and who are open to conversation, who are open to data, who are open to context. You can't say the environment doesn't matter. You can't say it's because people are lazy. You can't say it's because it was a long time ago. You can't say any of those things in the face of that information. And for the people for whom that matters, let's work with them and figure out how we can make a really good impact. That's my thought.
I just want to say thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Before I came in, I definitely knew nothing about the subject, and you've definitely changed my mind about it. That's just what I want to say, first of all.
Thank you.
Second thing I wanted to ask was, in your presentation, you stated that Europeans who immigrated and came through Ellis Island, more capital was invested in them through their education than Black Americans.
Absolutely.
However, my question is, what would it have been like for a Black immigrant who immigrated at that time? Would there be more money invested into their education than a Black American?
So they circumvented that through the immigration laws. They had laws that were extraordinarily. They would limit the number of people who could immigrate to the country by a percentage of the folks that were currently here, foreign-born folks that were currently here. So if you think how many Ghanaians were here in the early 1900s, not many. A small percentage of that would be allowed to come in. It was just a very clever, creative way to ensure that you don't have immigration from African or Black, countries into the U.S. So they circumvented even having that problem. And if they came in to New York City and they were allowed to go to those schools, they would presumably get better education. But you also have to understand that the level of explicit, hostile animosity towards, like, people were still being killed, right? Back in those days, the Bronx Zoo, you ever know the Bronx Zoo, had like Black people on display in the zoo during those times. Like, people are still trying to figure out if Black people had souls. Like, there's a reason why we don't kind of talk about this stuff. And a lot of that thinking is what affected people's ability to, like, come together, work together, live together, play together, do all the kind of things that we could have otherwise have done, and it's unpacking some of that stuff is what we have to do now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is that that's the last question? All right.
All right. Thank you again, everyone. Again, I'm Michael Coates. I'm the Xi Psi Affinity Chapter President. Thank you for attending today, and thank you for your powerful delivery and information, Brother Shawn Rochester. We greatly appreciate it. It was dynamite, and definitely going to echo everything we learned today to the people that we see, hopefully, the people to our left, the people to our right, and most importantly, the people in our family, because that's where it starts. You definitely want to start with your own porch first, and then hopefully it spreads like wildfire. At this time, I would like to give an award to Brother Shawn Rochester for your dedication and contributions to our community. Will make a difference. Thank you for being a part of our legacy today and tomorrow. Thank you on behalf of Xi Psi Chapter. We want to give you this award, everyone.